This is Blake Temez with the Blake Temez podcast, where I speak as a Catholic layman to Catholic laymen about missional living, wisdom cultivation, and legacy building in service of Christ and his bride, the Church. Thanks for being here. Spiritual development is helped along a great deal by having a spiritual director that one meets with on a regular basis. For those of you who are new to the idea of a spiritual director, they come in many forms, and depending on where you are and what kind of access you have to spiritual directors, you may come across different schools of thought as to who a spiritual director is, who can be a spiritual director, and exactly what function they perform. For example, I did not grow up with any idea of a spiritual director or what they might do for you. It wasn't until I got to college that it became a recommendation for young men and young women who were discerning a vocation to the priesthood, of course, in the case of young women, to the religious life, for young people that were discerning to have a spiritual director to consistently explore that possible vocation with. And in my college days, it was often assumed that a spiritual director would be a priest, and that priest would also serve the role of being your confessor, meaning that you could consistently go to the sacrament of reconciliation with them when going to them for spiritual direction. Now, that image or that idea of a spiritual director being a priest as well as a confessor was reinforced in my experience of spiritual direction in a year with a religious community in which each of us who were going through formation were assigned a spiritual director who was a senior member of the community, who was a priest. Now, when I moved back home to South Texas, I realized that my archdiocese was one in which there is a school of formation for lay people to become certified as spiritual directors, both men and women, and that they had the liberty, once certified, to take on whoever they might want to take on as a spiritual directee. So in other words, it wasn't going to be just limited to being a recommendation for young men and women discerning a religious vocation, but that there could be a wider pool of people who were seeing a spiritual director for as a means of spiritual development. And that gets into some differences of roles that spiritual directors play. Again, there can be that role of vocational discernment where there's kind of a more proximate goal of making a major life decision when it comes to one's state of life. And then there's this other school of practice where it's more related to a general interpretation of God's activity in one's life and making sense of his presence and how to see the events of one's life, both distant past and more recent past, how to make sense of those events in light of God's providence and to make room for the Holy Spirit to speak into that. So that's more general, right? A broader focus than simply making a life decision of state of life. And so I've benefited from having spiritual directors, throughout my life from college on to the present day, although they've served different functions at different times. It should be emphasized that it's significant to find a spiritual director that you can trust, that you believe is well formed and prepared to guide you, whether it's for vocational discernment or spiritual development in general. I have found that because many people associate the role of spiritual director with priestly ministry and can make that association in a legitimate way, but if that association is perhaps too strong or taken for granted, then you might end up with a priest spiritual director who is not well trained or well formed for that role. They may be an excellent minister in other realms, but their theological training and ordination in themselves do not mean that they'll be gifted in terms of individual directing of people in their spiritual development. And so that, just making that as a note, that it can be the case that we would gravitate towards a priest that we respect and value their ministry in many areas, but we want to be sober-minded when it comes to our interactions with them in spiritual direction, and remaining free to to move on to another director if it seems that that priest is not particularly suited for that role. That can be a hard judgment to make on one's own. So, kind of approach that judgment with humility and getting the perspective of other mentor figures or those who have had experiences in spiritual direction. Maintaining both confidentiality, but also preserving the good name of everyone involved. But taking the matter of choosing a spiritual director seriously enough to recognize when one that you've started seeing is not the best fit, whether they be a clergy or a layperson. And in my experience, having a consistent spiritual director to meet with at least monthly, sometimes every 6 weeks or so, has been a really fruitful mainstay of my spiritual development. Sometimes I find that I'm going into a spiritual direction session and I don't always feel that I have something new to say or something novel to report on from the past month. But I found, especially with my current spiritual director, that because he makes space for the Holy Spirit to speak into the events of my life, that I don't need to be coming to the session with any kind of great insights or any incredible experiences in prayer or anything like that, but by simply asking questions, and good questions, and creating a prayerful atmosphere, there are things that are able to rise to the surface that I did not notice, before having the chance to discuss them openly with someone who is attentive and who, knows me well, but also is there to facilitate an encounter with God and not, psychoanalyze like a therapist might in their legitimate way. But spiritual direction being something else, ordered towards that connection with God. So I encourage you to find a spiritual director if you can. This is directed to you, especially if you're a mentor or a missionary or a minister who is speaking into the lives of young people, young men, as a way of having someone who is a part of your personal team, your personal formation team, and kind of keeping you at your best, kind of helping you to maintain that strong connection with Christ as you serve others, right? Having a person as a part of your team to pour time and care into you so that you can do likewise for other people. And so that is my recommendation for you. As always, thank you for your time and attention, and God bless you in all your efforts. Peace. If you're a young Catholic man or a mentor, missionary, or minister who works with them, or even just a concerned figure in their life, a parent, uncle, whoever it might be on the lookout for the release of a short guide that I'm putting together called Brothers by Blood: How to Forge a New Path for Catholic Manhood. In it, I'll expand on some of the topics in this podcast and give you some points of reflection to see about how you can be a part of a movement that empowers men and brings them to their full potential for their sake and also for the benefit of the church and, by extension, the benefit of all society. So, again, thank you for being a part of this, and look out for more information about the release of my guide in episodes to come.